manners maketh man. Do you know what that means? Then let me teach you a lesson.
You know what I've realized from watching a bunch of action movies? A lot of movies nowadays tend to really cheap out on the action scenes and focus either more on the other parts of the movie, or they just don't focus on any parts at all. So when the action does arrive in a movie, it comes off as really bland and generic. I found this really prevalent, especially in the MCU. Take Civil War, for example. It's got great character and world building, the pacing and the plot are very neat, and it's even some people's picks to being the best MCU movie. But when the action comes, it's just a bunch of people punching and kicking others, with no effect really other than just to move the plot forward. Now take The Winter Soldier. It's got pretty great choreography, and it's fun to watch. So why is it only pretty good and not the best? Well, the thing is that in the whole sequence, the choreography is fine, but they aren't really creative about it. It's just two people dodging and using their weapons in a pretty generic manner. And I think that's the struggle with most franchises nowadays. They think of the action scenes as an excuse to move the plot forward with just punching and kicking, but action is so much more than that. An example of action being done right is in Kingsman. The action scenes in Kingsman are so different from the MCU, and you can clearly tell by how the action is portrayed. I think what's interesting is that you could either love the first Kingsman, or you can completely hate it. But one thing that everyone tends to agree on is how top tier the action in Kingsman is. And when they say that, they like to point to the church scene in particular. But when they're asked why it's such a good fight scene, they really don't have a straight answer as to why they find it so fun to watch. So without further ado, I'm going to be giving my take on this scene, and I'm going to be explaining my reasonings as to why Kingsman not only does action well, but how they do it right. The scene begins when the villain turns up the volume of the SIM cards to trigger the people into fighting. Now, this is a great way to set up an action scene without telling us that there's actually going to be one. This is building anticipation. The viewer thinks that an action piece is going to happen, but they don't fully know that there will be an action sequence yet. And so when Harry shoots his first bullet into the person's head, it's all that much more satisfying. The music in this scene fits tonally as well, because after the first shot, it's represented as absolute carnage, which builds even more excitement as we view the scene. Another thing I'd like to point out is that when Harry initially starts moving, the frame rate starts decreasing and increasing, making the moves seem a lot more cartoony and fun to watch. It's a pretty cool tactic that they use in every one of these action pieces, and it's a really neat detail that adds a lot more to the sequence itself. Another editing thing that they do is speeding up the clip. When Harry goes to make a punch or a kick, the clip speeds up as it makes the move seem cooler and it adds more weight to it. Even these are a lot of what most action scenes don't seem to do. So there's already a big difference between this and a lot of the other action sequences in a lot of the other movies. The MCU doesn't do this at all. They just put two characters and they do karate against each other. There's nothing special to most of the fighting in the MCU. So I've talked about what most action movies don't do. Now I'm going to be talking about what modern movies don't try at all. Long takes. Now, when I say a long take, which scene do you think of? Is it the Daredevil hallway scene? Is it the long take in James Bond where he just walks down a building? Or is it just some fun Jackie Chan action? Well, one thing is for sure. The church scene using a long take was probably the best idea that they've had. The camera follows along with Harry as the action happens, and it makes us feel like we're there with him and even interacting in a way. The camera never pans out of Harry's point of view, and it keeps us extremely invested because there's so much going on, and focusing on one thing makes it a lot more anticipating and exciting to watch. Now, a long take, as the name suggests, is a long take. It doesn't have any cuts to it. For example, in the hallway scene in Daredevil, there aren't any cuts in that action piece. Now, when done wrong, long takes can be boring, but Daredevil does something extremely right. They ground the action. The whole scene is just Matt Murdock getting more and more tired, and it makes us invested because there's a really real chance that Matt might lose the fight. Meanwhile, the church scene slides in specific cuts to make us feel like it's still one cut, but we're still invested, because it's actually more than one. The scene uses a lot of special effects and really cool camera angles to perfectly envision what Harry sees and feels in the scene. Now, as I previously brought up, Jackie Chan also likes using long takes, although not as long as the other ones. One thing that really separates Jackie Chan's action from the rest is how Jackie Chan uses the environment to his advantage, making even the most harmless tools seem like a killing machine. The reason Jackie Chan's action is so fun is because he uses everyday things as weapons, and it's really cool to see a unique way of things being used. Now, why would I bring this point up? Because the church scene also does this, although not to the extent of Jackie Chan's. It's creative enough to make the action seem really interesting, and it keeps us hooked. When Harry runs out of bullets, he uses the gun as a knife. Harry puts a grenade in someone's pocket instead of throwing it. He uses the environment to his advantage, like stepping on a row of chairs to get the drop on the others. We've all seen those boring kicking and punching scenes with cuts every 2 seconds, and it's really repetitive. But Kingsman doesn't do this. Every single hit, shot, and stab has weight, and every move is creative, so it doesn't feel repetitive like the others. One final point I'd like to bring up, and this might just be the most important reason, is the pacing. When you look at bad action scenes, it's mostly because the flow of the scene is off, also known as the pacing of the action. Now, pacing isn't very prevalent when someone thinks of action, but it's actually the most important. See, you can have all those cool details, long takes, and music, but if the pacing is off, then the whole sequence would feel off. A tonally consistent pacing is more important than anything when it comes to action, because when your pacing is tonally inconsistent, the sequence would feel messy and rushed. We wouldn't be able to understand most things happening. A great example of bad action is the fight between Nightwing and Slade from Titans. The camera work makes the scene look very hard to watch. They go from cut to cut within milliseconds, and we're barely able to comprehend what's going on. Now, if slow action is bad, then how come Vader vs. Obi-Wan is so entertaining to watch? The whole fight comes off as extremely slow, yet we're so invested into the scene. Why is that? Well, that action piece really isn't an action scene, but more of a story moment. It's a moment for growth on Obi-Wan and Vader's character, so it doesn't have to rely on the action to make us invested. Now, I'm not saying that pacing is all you need in an action scene, but what I am saying is that pacing is the most important out of an action scene. The pacing in Kingsman is consistently fast, so it stays entertained, and the music choice, details, and effects of the action scene work. If an action scene isn't consistent, it's going to be bad. The reason why the church scene is the best action sequence out there is because not only is it consistent, but it has everything that all the other top tier action scenes have as well. All in all, Kingsman is just a fun and lighthearted film. It doesn't take itself too seriously like the other action movies, and I think most franchises forget that action is supposed to be fun to watch. It's supposed to just be a break from the rest of the movie, and it really isn't something that's thought of when someone says, what makes a movie good? And that's why most franchises breeze over the action. They don't see it as that important to the story, so they just add pointless action and call it a day. Action is supposed to be fun, but it's also supposed to make sense. Having an action sequence instead of spewing out exposition is an amazing way to do things, and it's exactly what Kingsman does. Because action isn't just punching and kicking, it's also telling a story within that punching and kicking narrative. So at the end of the day, a movie can be good without action, but to make an action film great, you have to do action right.